everybody. I don't make it over here enough. I need to come over and visit you guys. So as Greg mentioned, my name is Jason, and I work over there on the Indy side across the expanse of reclaimed wood and brick and all that kind of stuff over there. And over the past few years, I've been at Indy for 4 years in July, almost 4 years, and have also done a lot on the code school side as well up until towards the end of last year. And before coming to Envy, I ran a small independent branding and design studio. So I don't do as much branding these days, but I have a background in that, and it's still something that I enjoy doing. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about branding and how branding relates to us as small business owners or people that work in small businesses. Because I think when you think about branding, or at least when I think about branding, a lot of times we think about big companies, Starbucks, Apple, Nike, huge companies that have multi-million-dollar marketing and advertising and branding budgets. And it's sort of tough to take those principles and apply those to small businesses. Because I think for most of us here, we work in a small business environment where we don't have those type of budgets, we don't have that type of collateral behind us to do a lot of the things. Yeah?
It's very interesting that you're mentioning Starbucks and Apple as brands of big companies. Both of them started as a very small company. How did they did their branding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did start out as small companies. I'm not aware of as much of what they did in the early days. But we'll actually get to some of those things here in a minute. So I want to start out by some definitions just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page, talking about what a brand is and what branding is. So what a brand is what a person thinks or feels about something. And really, that's supposed to say about your company. But it's basically somebody's gut feeling, somebody's feeling about your business, your product, your service, whatever the case may be. Sort of the misconception a lot of times is we tend to think of our brand as what we think about it. But in reality, it's what our customers, our users, the people that we're marketing to think about it. Going back to a Starbucks example, what do you think of when you think of Starbucks? What are the first things that come to mind when you think Starbucks?
High-end coffee.
High-end coffee. What are some other things?
The place to meet.
Place to meet.
Expensive. Long line.
Yeah, long lines. Warm, inviting, cool spaces, right? You can go to a Starbucks anywhere around the world, and it might be slightly different, but you're going to feel like you're in Starbucks. There is that kind of universal look and feel and experience that you get going into Starbucks. So we all have kind of that gut feeling, that emotional thoughts and sort of triggers when we hear Starbucks or really any big brand. When it comes to branding, when it comes to developing your brand, it's ultimately not what you think your brand is, it's what your customers think it is. Because you're not branding to yourself, you're branding to your customers. And branding is the practice to get people to think or feel a certain way about your brand. So a brand is the feeling, the gut feeling that somebody might have as it relates to your product or service. Branding is what you do to try and help your customers and your users feel a certain way. And you do things to try to match their feelings to what you want their feelings to be. And the thing is that you're always branding, even if you think you're not. You're always doing things that add or subtract to that overall experience of your brand when somebody experiences that. So really the question is, how am I doing? It's not if I'm branding, it's how am I branding? And I think that's one of those things as small businesses, if we tend to have this concept that branding is really just for large companies, people with large budgets, we can think that we don't have to worry about that. But in reality, we do, because when people experience what we have, our products or our services, they are experiencing our brand. So here are a few common misconceptions. Maybe you've experienced this, or maybe you've know of somebody who's experienced this. These are some of the things that I've heard in the several years that I've done brand consulting. Number one, my marketing budget's all tapped out. so I'll have to postpone any branding efforts until later. And there's really, I think, two problems with this. The first is the equation of branding and marketing. Okay, those aren't necessarily the same thing. Marketing in many ways drives things to your brand, drives users, or drives certain feelings to your brand. So when you try to put branding in the marketing side of things right away, a lot of times that's not correct. And the other thing is when we think of a marketing budget, many times what we think of is an expense, just like any other expenses you would have in a business. And especially when you're first starting out or when you're trying to develop your brand, it's better to think of your brand as an investment as opposed to an expense, because you tend to think differently if you relate to it as an investment versus as an expense. How about the second one? I have a logo. So I have a brand, right? Well, logo is a part of a brand, but it doesn't make up all of the brand. A logo is basically your brand's ambassador. Many times it can be the first thing that somebody experiences about your product or your service, but it's not all of it. Sort of think of the tip of the iceberg, right? So your logo is the tip of the iceberg, but in order to have a tip of the iceberg, you have to have a bunch of stuff underneath. You have to have the rest of the iceberg. Or number three, my product is so different, I'm just gonna ride its uniqueness all the way to the bank. And many of you here are here in StarterStudio because you have very unique products. You have products that are solving a specific problem, and sometimes we put too much value in that, the fact that it's different, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So here are, real quickly, 3 keys of a successful brand, and then we'll get into more specifics, kind of 5 ways to build your brand, to have a successful brand. But 3 quick keys to a successful brand is you must be different, your brand must be different, but it also has to be relevant, and it has to be able to evolve. Okay, so what do we mean by this? Difference, relevance, and the ability to evolve. Well, first you must be different. Anybody remember Clear Pepsi back in the 90s? Anybody ever try Clear Pepsi? So Clear Pepsi was a different product, right? It was, I don't know who thought it up or who thought it would be a good idea, but it was this product that Pepsi produced, tasted kind of like Pepsi. It was supposed to taste like Pepsi. It tasted pretty bad, but it tasted kind of like Pepsi, but it was clear. So it was a different product, but it didn't do very well. And it didn't do very well because people didn't care about it. People are like, well, if I'm gonna drink that, why not just drink Pepsi, or why not just drink Sprite or something else that's much better than Clear Pepsi? So first, your product has to be different, but as we'll talk about in a minute, you also have to have a product that people care about. So some questions to ask yourself: who are the main competitors in your industry? Who are the people that you would say, these are the companies, these are the products that kind of are competitors to my product? And then what makes your product different? Or why would someone want to use your product versus theirs? Start making those lists, or jot down a few ideas. And then look at how your product must be relevant. So again, it's not just about being different. Clear Pepsi was different, but the product failed because nobody cared about it. It also has to be relevant to your target market, to the people that you're trying to reach. So what about your product makes people care? What are the elements about your product that people can latch onto and say, oh, that's really awesome, it's different, and it's relevant to me specifically, therefore I want to use that? Or why can't your customers live without you? What are those aspects and elements of your brand, of your product, that people can't live without? And then finally, you must be able to evolve. And so in order to do this, you have to maintain a pulse on the market, right? You have to know what's going on. You have to evaluate where things are going to be going over the next several months, the next several years. Sometimes that's tough to do, especially in the tech space, because things change so quickly. But what are those things, maybe as you look forward, that you can see you might have to do some pivot, or you might have to change things a little bit? I think a really good example of this is Lego. I love Legos. I have an 8-year-old son, which means I have an excuse to play with them and not look like a weirdo. But Lego, they're awesome, right? You can build whatever you want. But Lego has kind of gone, I wouldn't say a pivot, but they've evolved in many ways over the past several years. I don't know, has anybody played any of the Lego games on Wii or any of the video game consoles?
The Lego World?
there's that one, and then I think the new Lego movie has a game, and there's an Indiana Jones one, and there's a bunch of different ones, right? They're awesome. They're so much fun. They're really well designed. They have great plots. They're really funny. They have some really intelligent humor in it. They've done a really, really good job, not just being the company that are about the blocks, but they've sort of taken their product, they've taken their brand, and they've evolved it to keep up with the times. They have stuff now where you can actually learn like how to code, how to build, robots and things like that. So there's all sorts of things that they're doing in the video game space, in the education space, that keeps their brand vibrant, keeps it top of mind, and just makes it fun to use. So you got to be different. You have to be relevant. People have to care about it, and then you've got to have a pulse on the market so that you can evolve. All right. So these are the 5 steps that when I've worked with clients in the past that I sort of take clients through. And they're pretty broad. We're going to go through them fairly quickly. We could probably spend a lot of time on each one, but we won't do that today. So we'll just kind of do a high-level overview of each one. So here are the 5 Ds, because I like alliteration. Discover your vision, define your strategy, design brand identity, develop brand experience, and drive brand interaction. Say that 5 times fast. Okay, so number 1, discover your vision. So a vision is a clear picture of where you want to be. Think of it as your destination as a company, as a business. Where do I want to go? What's that final end point for my product or my business? And the reason being is because a vision can provide very clear direction as you continue to grow as a business. It can give purpose to the things that you do on a day in, day out basis. And it can influence the practices that you take over the course of developing your product. So the first step in building a successful brand is to figure out what your vision is. What's the final destination? Where do you want to go? So for example, because I get this question a lot, are vision and mission the same kind of thing? They can be, but I think it's helpful to try and split them out a little bit, because your vision, again, is that end destination. So maybe my vision is a world where everyone knows how to code. That's my end goal and my vision. That's what I want to see happen at the end of the day. My mission then is to teach people how to code. You can kind of see the difference there. Vision is that long-term destination. Your mission is a little bit more practical steps for how to get there. But you need to know what your vision is starting out, because otherwise you don't know where you're going. If you think of it like taking a trip somewhere, so say I'm going to San Francisco, and I don't necessarily know that I'm going there. I just get in the car and start driving. I have no way of knowing where I'm going because I don't have an end destination in mind. So if you have a product and you don't necessarily know what your vision is, where you want to take it, it's going to be all over the place in terms of how you are building that brand, how you are developing that. So it's important to know what your vision is. It doesn't necessarily have to be incredibly grand, like the entire world knowing how to code. Maybe it's a little smaller. That's fine. But have something that you're pointing at and that you're reaching towards. How many of you guys have seen Simon Sinek's TED Talk, The Power of Why? Has anybody seen that? Good. So homework if you haven't, or even if you had, just to watch it again. Google Simon Sinek, The Power of Why. He also has a book on it as well. But in this talk, he describes this concept that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And so it's really transforming your perspective and how you're building your product or your business to try to get people to identify with and buy into the why. That's how you get loyal customers. That's how you build a brand that's ultimately successful for a long time. And that goes back to kind of vision. If you have a very clear vision, you can say, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. This is the purpose behind it. And then it drives the decisions that you make on a day in, day out basis, because it's reaching towards that end goal. That's the why that you do things. And then Philip Knight, who was the co-founder of Nike, said that we wanted Nike to be the world's best sports and fitness company. And once you say that, you have a focus. You don't end up making wingtips or sponsoring the next Rolling Stones world tour, which would still be kind of fun, but that wasn't part of his focus of being the best sports and fitness company. And so the reason we do this, again, is so that we have a destination that we're pointing at, that we can look at and see, okay, that's where we're going. And then we can evaluate decisions on that path to get there and see, do those actually line up with what our vision is? Because otherwise, we might make decisions and spin our wheels all over the place and figure out a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road that we haven't really gotten anywhere because we don't really know which way we're going. So the first step, we have to discover our vision, figure out what that is. And as an application, craft a vision statement. If you don't have one, I know it sounds very textbook, business school, kind of, define your vision. But it's one of those things that I think is still very important because you need to know where you're going as a company. So when you're doing this, it needs to be probably pretty short. It doesn't need to be paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs. You don't have to try to do a bunch of different things. Keep it concise. Make sure that you're passionate about it. Make sure that it's realistic. And make sure that you're trying to keep it as simple as possible. A good example of this is John F. Kennedy in the 60s when he came out and said, by the end of the decade, we want to put a man on the moon. He was passionate about it. It was something that he personally wanted to see happen. It was fairly realistic. I mean, anytime you say you're going to put a man on the moon, that's sort of outside of the bounds of what probably you and I could do. But it wasn't like he was saying we're going to, I don't know, create a new moon. He was at least, doing something that they had been working on at NASA for the past several years. And he kept it fairly simple. By the end of the decade, we're going to put a man on the moon, so that the entire country could get behind that, could identify with him, could also be passionate about it, could say, okay, we have a clear picture, that's what we want to do. By the end of the 60s, we want to have somebody on the moon. Number two, once you've got your vision statement in place, once you understand where it is you're going, then you need to define your strategy. And really, your strategy is your roadmap to your destination. So again, going back to that trip analogy, if I identify my destination as San Francisco, then I could say, okay, I'm in Orlando, I need to get to San Francisco. How am I going to get there? What does that look like? I could fly, I could drive, I could walk, I could swim, I could do a bunch of different things to get there. And you could start to break down, okay, the how now is up to me to determine the best way to get to that final destination. But you don't want to start defining your strategy and figure out the next steps to something if you don't have that end vision in place. Now this is terrible grammar, I know, but it's a concept of doing smart. Has anybody seen the show on the Discovery Channel, Survivor Man? Does anybody watch that show? Am I the only one? So it's a really interesting show. I like to watch it. It's a guy named Les Stroud. He's a Canadian adventure racer, survivalist kind of guy. And basically, it's an hour-long show, and he goes to all sorts of remote places, takes his own cameras, films the entire 5, 7, 10-day trek of actually surviving in the Amazon jungle or Antarctica or wherever he is. But it's really cool because he films it all himself. My son really likes to watch it, and so I came home the other day, and we had bamboo in our backyard. So he cut down a bunch of bamboo, and he was like trying to get water out of it because he was thirsty and wanted to go inside and get water. But he has a concept, and he talks a lot about this in the show, where if you're in a survival situation, you have to do smart. You only have a limited amount of energy. You have a limited amount of water and food and things like that. And in order to survive for an extended period of time, you have to be very intentional about the things that you do. So he's very intentional to sort of list out in his mind, okay, today I have to build a shelter, then I have to find water, then I have to find food, and then I have to do this, this, and this. He's very calculated in what he does step by step, so as not to waste energy, so as not to put himself in a worse situation so that he can actually survive. And I think in business, as we're growing our businesses and building our brands, it's kind of the same thing. We need to know what those steps are and be very intentional and not just say, okay, today I'm going to mass produce 5,000 postcards and just do a direct mail piece. And then tomorrow I'm going to do a social media campaign. And then next I'm going to do this and next I'm going to do that. Sort of spinning our wheels, figuring and trying to do all sorts of different things all at the same time. We have to be smart. We have to be intentional about the steps that we're taking. And again, you got to know your vision, you got to know your destination, from there you can craft a roadmap and make sure that you're being very intentional throughout that whole thing. So as application, set some goals. Whatever your vision is, you can say, okay, in order to get there, here's what I have to do. Here's some goals for me to get there. Create your brand positioning platform, and that is what we talked about a little bit earlier, your difference and your relevance. Those two things. You can say, okay, for my brand, this is how I'm different, this is how I'm relevant. That's your brand positioning platform. That's how you position your brand to your customers. Number 3, define and study your target market. So figure out who your users are, and then make sure you're studying them. Ideally, you're knowing more about them than they know about themselves. That means that you are doing things effectively so that you can create products or pivot your product or make changes to your product such that it makes their lives better, it makes their experiences better. And then finally, assemble audits. And this is an exercise that we do a lot when we're doing any sort of branding. And there's usually 3 audits that I do. I do a competitive audit, so I look at who my competitors are, and really an audit is just a document where you put a lot of information down. So for the competitive audit, I'm going to look at all my competitors, I'm going to study them, and I'm going to evaluate what they're doing, right, wrong, what I would do differently, things like that. Then I do a marketing audit. So a lot of times if I have an existing company, or even if it's a new company, maybe you've got some things, some initiatives that you've done before. You can sort of take a marketing audit, figure out what was done well, if anything, figure out what needs to change, and then do a design audit. So see, where am I at as a brand, as a company? Do I have any design? Do I have an identity? Are there things that need to change? And you can also do those for your competitors. You can kind of take that competitive audit and do those 2 sub-audits as a part of that. But really, that's just a measure of getting as much information about the space as you possibly can so that you can make sure that your brand positioning platform, your difference and your relevance is accurate and it's the best it can be. All right, so once we've defined our vision, once we've figured out how we're going to get there, strategy and the roadmap, now we actually start designing brand identity. And this is one of those things where if I'm doing brand consulting with a client, typically it'll be weeks, sometimes even months before we actually get to designing anything on the brand side. And people look at that and go, well, that seems kind of crazy, because wouldn't you just start designing a logo? But if you don't have those strategic things in place, it's just like spinning your wheel. You're going to design a logo, you're going to start building all of these different things, building a site, building an ad campaign, and you're not going to know where you're going or how you're going to get there. So it's important to do those exercises up front before you start getting into the specific production work of actually building out a brand identity. So what is a brand identity? Essentially, it's the look, feel, and experience of your brand. So it's what you come in contact with when we think about, again, Starbucks. It's that experience, it's that look and feel. It's those things that are in our minds and are in our experiences when we think about a brand. The first thing is to develop what's called your brand idea. And this is that short little statement that encapsulates your vision, your mission, your goals, who you are as a company. And it's tough to figure out what this is. It's tough to make it short and sweet. Target's expect more, pay less. FedEx, the world on time. Apple's used to be think different. Nike is just do it, right? So for Code School, we have learn by doing. Envy, we're actually going through a rebranding exercise on that. And essentially what that's become is transforming ideas into successful products. So basically your brand idea is this statement that is what you're about. That's what you can point to and say, this is who we are as a company, as a business, as a product. And that should match up with your vision, it should match up with your strategy. Next, you want to focus on naming. What's your name? And this is fun and it's terrifying at the same time because it's incredibly difficult to come up with a good name, as you guys have probably experienced in building your own companies. Naming is tough. And so here are some things to keep in mind. When you're choosing a name, is it easy to say? Is it easy to remember? Is it too complex? Is it a long name that is like, IBM used to be what? integrated business machines or something like that? Is it one of those sort of corporate sounding names, or is it something that's easy to remember, easy to say? Is it available? Can you trademark it? Is there a good domain if you're a software company or a technology company? Are you going to run into legal issues down the road? Those are the things you need to evaluate before you actually go down this road. And then make sure you're testing it in context before you make the decision. So some of the exercises we'll do is we'll actually build out fake business cards, or we'll even build out like a fake environment where we'll test, somebody calling you on the phone, and you can answer with the name and how you would actually use it in a real world situation, and see if it's good or if it really sucks. Because once you start getting into those contextual situations, you can actually see if it's going to work in the real world. And then work on your visual strategy. So this is that large encompassing piece that is essentially designing all of the look and feel about your brand. So we're talking about things like logo, figuring out your typography, color palettes, what type of imagery you're going to be using. What's the mood of your brand? Is it playful? Is it elegant? Is it formal? Is it professional? Is it fun? Is it whimsical? And then make sure you're developing a brand style guide. So basically what this is it's a book. It can be as short as one page. It can be as many as hundreds of pages if you're a large company. And essentially you're listing out all of the major attributes about your brand so that an internal team or an external team can look at that and figure out how to effectively integrate your brand into whatever touch point you're creating. So this is important, again, if you have an internal team, but it's, I think, even more important if you use freelancers. So I would imagine a lot of you guys here use freelancers from time to time, whether it's to design things for print, web design, whatever the case may be. And as you'll find out, designers are very opinionated, and they like to do things their own way. And if there's not a set structure for them to follow to say, okay, this is our look and feel, this is the type of mood our brand is, these are the attributes about our brand, here are some examples and guidelines to follow when you're integrating our logo and our other brand elements into all these things. This is what I want you to follow so that it's consistent across the board. I would argue that consistency is better than having something trendy. Okay, so there's kind of a movement to sort of make sure that your brand is keeping up with everything that's out there, all of the things that are changing, all of the trendy new design techniques and new things like that. I would argue if you have a consistent brand, even if it's simple, even if it's maybe a little outdated, if it's consistent, it's going to have more impact, and there's going to be more power behind it than if it's a trendy sort of a brand. So make sure that you are keeping things consistent. That, above all else, will make sure that your brand is remembered. It'll make sure that you have a consistent feeling when other people access it. And it's tough. Consistency and simplicity are two of the hardest things, but it's one of the things to fight for when you're designing your identity. If you choose to go, because there's a lot of different ways you can design these types of things, right? You can hire a professional designer. You can go to 99 Designs and all of the different things in between. If you hire a designer, two pitfalls that I've found in designing your identity. The first is not hiring the right designer, so make sure that you're really evaluating the people that you want to work on your brand. Make sure that they, A, have the skill set, understand what they're doing, make sure that they identify with you, that they can see what you're passionate about, that they can see what you want the brand to be. And then make sure once you've hired them, assuming that it's a professional designer, give them the freedom to create something for you. You're hiring them to do a service, and you're relying on their expertise and on their experience. A lot of times what I've seen, some of the negative things that happen, is a company will hire a really good designer and then hamstring them because they're trying to get all of these things in place. So make sure that you're hiring the right person, and once you have the right person, you're trusting in them to come up with a good brand for you. And then again, consistency over trendy. The goal is to create consistency across the board. So that's the reason why you have brand style guides. That's the reason why you have these things, to make sure that from A to Z, your brand is consistent across the board. And if you don't have that, it will not be consistent. As much as you think it will be, it won't be consistent. You'll change a font at this place. You'll use a slightly different color green in this place. and before long you're going to have a sort of a jumbled mess. Lots of different inconsistent brand touch points, and it's not going to accurately represent who you are. So after we've developed our brand identity, the next is to develop brand experience. And so these are all of the touch points that you'll be creating depending on what your company is, that you'll need to create in order to do those branding exercises. And so the question isn't if your users, if your customers are experiencing, it's what they're experiencing, how they're experiencing it, what they're experiencing it. Because again, you're never not branded, you're always branding. If you're putting your company out there, if you're trying to sell a product, sell a service, whatever the case may be, you're always branding. So it's important to always be evaluating and see if I can do things better. So here's some good exercises to do. What are your brand touch points? What are the things I need to create as a business? If I'm a tech company, if I have a digital product, I know I'm going to need a website. I know I'm going to need a good UI for my digital product. I might not need to do a ton of print application, but maybe there's some digital marketing initiatives that I need to do. Maybe I need to do a lot of e-newsletter type things. If you are a service, look at some things that you can present yourself as the expert. So some touch points might be a really solid blog, maybe another e-newsletter service, things that you can do to represent yourself as the expert in a particular field. So for your company, whether it's a product, a service, a digital product, a non-digital product, figure out what those touch points are going to be. Start creating a list and figure out what those are. Because if you don't, what'll end up happening is you'll say, oh, I need a website. And then the next day you'll say, oh, I need to do this campaign, or I need to do this. And you'll find yourself reacting instead of preparing for things. And when you think about things intentionally, you're going to produce a lot better things. Also define who are your users. Again, going back to conducting those audits. Who are your users? Do you know them effectively? What are ways that you can know them better? Am I talking to them? Am I interacting with them? Am I figuring out what they need, what problems they have, what I can solve for them? What's your budget? Obviously, budget and time frame are incredibly essential in this, because like we discussed before, we don't have $100 million budgets in these companies, right? We have much, much smaller, so that can affect what you do. And then make sure you are prioritizing. Again, going back to that Survivor Man example, you don't have to do everything all at once. You can do things sequentially, just make sure that you're prioritizing. And by doing these exercises, you can figure out what are the most important things that I need to do in order to increase sales, in order to have income coming in order to create a successful business. And then finally, after we've done all that, we can start talking about driving brand interaction. And so this is something that you'll do on an ongoing basis once you actually have a brand in place, once you have a business in place, and you're starting to create these touch points. And once you have those in place, you're starting to iterate on them and change them and do all of those necessary things. You need to make sure that sort of infused all the way throughout that you're telling your story. The way that we do branding is much different than what we did even 50 years ago. If you watch Mad Men, a big thing in that time, 50s, 60s, was talking about when you had a particular product, this is how the product makes you feel, right? In the early 1900s, it was, this is what the product does. Here are all the things about what the product does. Then it was like what the product feels, how it makes you feel. These days, it's very much about telling your story. People want to identify much more on a human level with the product that you're buying. So if you have a digital product, try not to make it this sort of abstract product. Try to add some human elements to it. Tell your story. Make sure that you're interacting with your users to know what they need, to talk to them, and to have this sort of two-way conversation going. So there's kind of 3 C's to remember: care, community, and conversation. People want to know that you care about them. If you're building a product or a service for them, they want to know that you care about their well-being, care about their experience, care that they have an enjoyable time using whatever it is that you're trying to sell. And the more that you can do that, the more loyal they're going to be in the long term. You want to build community. The best thing that you can do is to build loyal community around your product or around your service. And then you'll find you have to do less and less marketing, because a lot of times that gets done for you. So work to build that community. And a lot of times that's just talking to people. reaching out to people. Again, driving that interaction. And then finally, make sure that you're having a conversation. It's not just a one-way, I'm putting out all this information, I'm just writing blog posts, I'm just tweeting, I'm just doing all of these things. I'm never listening, I'm never asking for feedback, I'm never having this two-way dialogue. Make sure it's a dialogue. You're not just telling things, you're actually telling and listening and then talking and having a conversation. Your brand is your business. And so I think if there's one thing to take away, branding is not something that's optional. It's not something that is just one other thing that you have to do in the midst of building a business. Your brand is your business. It's your business's personality. It's what people think about when they hear your name, when they go to your website, when they call you on the phone, when they send you an email. All of these things are adding to that mental image of your brand in their minds. So make sure that you're investing in it, that you're nurturing it, that you're growing it. And as I mentioned before, I think one of the biggest keys here is to make sure that you're treating it as an investment, not as an expense. Because if you treat something as an investment, you think about it differently. You're expecting more from it, right? You're expecting it to increase the returns for you. You're expecting it to be a positive thing. An expense is always something going out. It's always a negative. It's always something that potentially you can cut corners and find a way to get it done the cheapest way possible. So the more that you can treat your brand and branding efforts as an investment, the more you're going to have a positive outlook on it, the more you're going to want to invest in it, as opposed to being an expense when all you're trying to do is find the cheapest way of doing it. So I have a bit of a shameless plug, which I thought that was pretty fun. I do have a book. I wrote an ebook a couple of years ago on this, and so if you're interested, there's a lot more that we talked about today. I go into a lot more detail. There's a little bit more application in there. If you enter Starter, you get $5 off. So that's all cool. That's all the shameless plug that I'll do. And that's it. I wanted to leave some time for questions. We can talk specifically about your companies, your products, and see if we can figure out how to do this whole thing together. So thank you guys for listening today.
Tips on rebranding.
Rebranding. Yeah, we're actually going through it over at Indy. So I think one of the biggest things is to evaluate how much of a rebrand do you need. Do you need a complete rebrand where for whatever reason, maybe it was a negative brand before, maybe something happened and you have to kind of distance yourself from it? Or is it more just being a little bit more modern, refreshing it, something like that?
In my particular case, going from just supplying information to bloggers in the state to bloggers anywhere.
Okay.
So I'm getting rid of that Florida part.
Gotcha. So it's more of a national kind of thing. I would try, because you probably built up a lot of equity in the state of Florida already. So it's probably not going to do you a huge service to completely make it seem like it's a different product. You want to maintain that equity that you built here. So it's probably not as much of a refresh as you might think. There's probably a lot that goes on behind the scenes that your end user's not going to see as much of a difference because they're already used to that. They've already built up loyalty to that, things like that. So I would probably keep naming conventions the same, maybe even look and feel the same, just kind of modernizing it. And that's kind of what we did with Envy. We didn't want to lose that equity that we built up over the last several years. So basically what we did, we wanted to make it a little bit more professional, almost make it a little bit more mature. We kind of needed it to grow up a little bit. So it used to be kind of, as you've seen, we have some of our older logos back there, but lots of robots and fun, quirky kind of things. We wanted the mood to be a little more mature, a little bit more warm.